This evening, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Goldhor as our speaker. Dr. Goldhor, a biologist, originally worked with animals for her research, but over the years, her thoughts turned to mushrooms, to fungal biochemistry, and finally to ecology. Currently, in addition to being a columnist for two major mycological journals, Dr. Goldhor is president of the Boston Mycological Club, where, as she puts it, she's been able to, quote, make sure our members are offered the opportunity to learn some real mycology in addition to learning how not to poison themselves, unquote. Tonight, Dr. Goldhor will speak of fungi, their partnerships with plants, and their importance to healthy ecosystems. And as stewards of our open spaces in Harvard, the better we understand nature's complex relationships, the better we can do our jobs. So now I'm happy to turn the screen over to Dr. Goldhor.
Great. Thank you, Abby, and thank all of you for inviting me to be your annual speaker. The few people that I've gotten to meet from the Harvard Trust have been incredibly impressive. I think that you are all lucky to have such smart and dedicated people working on behalf of conservation in Harvard. I do have to make two apologies to start with. One is I am not talking about mushrooms. That was a misunderstanding. I apologize for that. But I am going to talk about the ecosystems of your land and how the fungi underneath the soil are controlling them. And the other apology that I have to make is I've never, ever been able to figure out how to work the pointer on Zoom. So you're gonna have to figure out what I'm talking about. So are you, let's see. I hope you're seeing this now.
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Okay, great. So one of the things that's interesting is that explorers have always looked for terra incognita, and they've looked in the polar regions, they've looked in space, they've looked in the deep ocean. But in fact, the most important and the least explored terra incognita is terra. It's the soil on which we depend, about which we know so little until recently when we've started to learn, and which we have abused so appallingly. In fact, healthy soil is an amazingly rich ecosystem, which has been invisible to us until the development of both microscopes and DNA analyses. You've all heard the story of the famous teaspoonful of soil. You know, one teaspoonful of soil has more bacteria than there are humans on planet Earth. An entomologist who was looking at soil from an old growth forest found that when you put your foot down on that forest, your foot is landing on 16,000 invertebrates, if you have an average size foot. A handful of soil might contain more than a mile of fungal filaments like these. And here are those same fungal filaments under magnification. So one thing that's clear from this picture is that unlike looking at the invertebrates, a microscope does not help you to identify anything here. And that's why DNA has been so important in figuring out what is going on underground. But before we go underground, I am going to give you a one slide lesson in mycology. So genetically, fungi are much closer to animals than they are to plants, despite the fact that they've been classified with plants from the time of Linnaeus up until the 1930s. Like us, fungi inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Like us, fungi cannot photosynthesize, so they have to depend on plants to get their carbohydrates. Like plants and animals, fungi now have their own kingdom, and that kingdom, we have no idea how many organisms, how many species it includes. First people said maybe 1 million, then they said maybe 5 million. Now some people are saying maybe 10 million. But since most fungi are microscopic and are almost impossible to either easily see or easily identify, the fact is that everywhere we look, we find more species of fungi. So we have no idea. So the reason that we're all interested in mushrooms is that you can see them. You know, they are the charismatic mega fungi that you see when you walk through the forest. But is a mushroom a fungus? Well, mushrooms are the sexual fruiting bodies of a very small fraction of fungi. I mean, less than 1% of fungi, even in the forest, produce mushrooms. So this is the real fungus. It's called a mycelium. It can extend for miles. In fact, a mycelium is the largest organism on Earth. There's one in Oregon that is thousands of years old. It covers many square miles. The Forest Service officially calls it the humongous fungus. And it is basically immortal. It could, if nothing happened to bother it, it could live forever. So there are all these mycelia, all these fungal filaments, which are called hyphae, underground in the forest, very few of which can form mushrooms. And until we had DNA analysis, we had no idea they were there. We had no idea how many species. And the question really is, what are they doing? And the answer is that they are forming relationships with plants. The saprophytes are the rotters. They're the ones that keep us from being buried under dead wood, dead leaves, etc. The pathogens, which is what people often think most fungi are the disease organisms. They attack and sicken or kill plants. And the mycorrhizal fungi are symbiotic with the roots of living plants. And by the difference in color, you can tell that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about mycorrhizal fungi, or really mycorrhizas, which are tiny organelles on and in the roots of plants, where a fungus has taken up housekeeping or maybe married a plant. I like to think of it as marriages because it explains a lot about the different relationships. So mycorrhiza comes from the Greek mycor, fungus, rhiza, root. It's a fungus root. And a mycorrhiza is basically the site of nutrient exchange. The plant is photosynthesizing, the top part of the plant is photosynthesizing, and down in the roots, some of the sugars that it manufactures are being given to the fungus, which in turn is supplying the plant with nutrients and water. It is basically giving the plant its NPK as if it were the gardener, which in a way it is. This tells you that mycorrhizas are actually pretty important. And this is a fairly authoritative quote. So in fact, a lot of experts believe that when plants first came onto dry land, which was about 450 million years ago, they didn't have roots. They had mycorrhizas, and the mycorrhizas were their roots. So here we have a picture of two pine seedlings. You've probably seen this picture, it's all over the place. But on the left, this is a seedling that would never exist in nature. It could only happen in a test tube where it has been carefully protected from mycorrhizal fungi. And on the right, you see an identical pine seedling that has been allowed to have a mycorrhizal partner. So it is the fungal partner that provides the real functional roots of the plant. And in this case, the functional roots are the hyphae. Those are the white threads that are coming out from these root tips, which have been encased by the fungus in this case. And they are longer than tree roots. They are much thinner than tree roots. They can go further. They can get into tiny crevices. They can find water when the roots can't. Of course, the roots have been covered up, so they can't do it, but that's marriage. And they are functioning as the plant's roots. So why should the plant, want this or like this or put up with it? And that is that mycorrhizae, having fungal partners, can increase the plant immune responses. And we think that this initially happens when the fungus penetrates that root to form the mycorrhiza. The penetration can be seen as a kind of infection that sort of jolts the plant's immune response. A lot of mycorrhizals can digest organic material and obtain nitrogen. Some can actually kill and digest small animals to give their plants even more nitrogen. They can extrude acids that will free up phosphorus from the mineral particles that it's bound to. They can get water from distances during droughts. They can allow survival in extreme environments, for example, high salinity or extreme heat, like 120 degrees. And they can reduce soil pathogens. And they do this both by covering up that root to literally physically protect it, and also by acidifying the soil so that to reduce the pathogens. Not all mycorrhizal fungi can do all of this, but some of them can do all of these things, or at least the plant wants a variety of mycorrhizal partners so that it can get all of these benefits. So sorry, this was just to say they reduce the soil pathogens both by covering the tip and physically protecting it, and also acidifying the soil. And that is why we have acid soil here in New England, by the way. So not every plant on Earth has mycorrhizal partners, but most of the plants on Earth have them. The plant species that are non-mycorrhizal, many of them are crucifers, things like broccoli, cabbage, that family. There are some non-mycorrhizal plants that attack mycorrhizas. They really don't like mycorrhizas. And I bring that up because one of those is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a really successful invasive because it exudes a poison that kills mycorrhizas in the neighboring plants. And by killing the mycorrhizas, it weakens the plant and ultimately kills it. And then it can move further into the environment. So when you see this lovely plant, you should not only get rid of it, but you should make sure to get rid of all the roots. And I know that Brian will be pushing you on that. So to get back to the 92% of the world's plants that have mycorrhizas, here's mycorrhizas and the mycelia that grows out of them on one seedling in the lab. So in real life, you don't have one single seedling. So what happens when you have more than one? Well, a hypha from one tree can join with a hypha from another as long as they're the same species. And so in an actual forest, a tree may have access to hundreds of species of mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, a friend of mine, a Canadian mycologist, has pointed out, it's a little bizarre that in our northern forests, we have such a limited number of tree species, and we have thousands of species of mycorrhizal fungi. So this is what happens basically. each tree has mycorrhizal connection with many species of fungi, because different fungi are bringing it different advantages. And it's the hyphae from its mycorrhizal fungi are joining the hyphae of those same fungi from other trees. And they are basically forming a web. So if you can imagine a huge web of mycelia joining together to link maybe even a forest, this is the wood wide web. And this is an actual web plotted on a Douglas fir forest of mixed ages. And you can see these are trees of different trunk diameters and different ages, etc. This is a Douglas fir forest, so it's from the Pacific Northwest. Whoops, I seem to be going. Okay, what is this web doing? Basically, when the web was really analyzed, the tall trees up in the canopy are photosynthesizing, and they are sharing their sugars with the smaller trees in the understory. And that was Douglas fir is a Pacific Northwest tree, but we have the same kind of situation often in our own forests. This is a hemlock forest. You can see how dark the understory is, but those larger trees are sharing sugars with the younger, smaller trees. The advantage is, of course, that when an older tree dies and leaves an opening in the canopy, the young ones are ready to take advantage of it. Okay, this is Suzanne Simard. I'm sure that many of you have heard of her. As a young scientist, she discovered the Wood Wide Web. She is Canadian. She's now on the faculty of UBC in Vancouver. And she was the one who showed that the big trees were feeding the little trees in the understory. Now, up until Suzanne's work, the forest, which was largely the domain of male foresters, was seen as a competitive capitalist ecosystem, with capital in the form of sunlight and the trees competing for that capital by crowding each other out in the canopy. So the first phenomena that Suzanne demonstrated was that those successful capitalists were in fact supplying sugars to the young trees down in the understory. And you can imagine the response of some of these eminent senior males to a young Canadian woman who was suggesting that the forest was in fact socialist. And actually, I have to say that it was the American male scientists who were pretty much the slowest to accept Suzanne's ideas, as I learned when I tried to publish an article about her work. other countries that had universal health care and things like that were more accepting of her ideas. But she was undaunted. And because she's a good scientist, the data finally became impossible to deny. And she was able to show that there was a flow of sugar from those with the surplus to those with a need. And it didn't take that long for even the recalcitrant guys who hated the idea of childcare in the forest to admit that it made sense for a big tree to support its seedlings because Darwinian fitness is measured by the genes that you leave for the next generation. So the original work was done on a single species plot. It was done on Douglas firs, but many forests, like most of ours, are multi-species. So once the idea of the Wood Wide Web, or what Suzanne is now calling tree talk, was established, a lot of scientists started looking closely at different forest plots. And what they discovered was that trees support more than their own offspring. In fact, they support more than their own species. So this is a really interesting slide. It's worth reading what it says, which was that by labeling the leaves, scientists were able to show that the carbon taken in by spruce and turned into sugars was traded to neighboring beech, larch, and pine trees. And this was not trivial. This was fairly, massive quantities of carbon that were going around the web. So that what's happening in a forest is not simple competition for resources. That in fact, there are very complicated exchanges that are going on. And then even more startling exchanges were discovered, because it turned out that the fungal webs were exchanging carbon over time as if plants were banks, making loans to each other and then calling those loans in at the time that they needed that resource. For example, deciduous trees might send sugars to smaller coniferous trees that were under them during the summer when the deciduous trees were leafed out and photosynthesizing. But then in winter, the coniferous trees might pay that sugar back to their taller neighbors. So this was to me, one of the most interesting exchanges of the maple and the trout lily. And the trout lilies, which you probably have in your lands, bloom in very early spring. They bloom in the understory. They're usually affiliated with maples, although not solely. And the upper picture actually shows trout lilies blooming, and you can see what time of year they bloom in. So what happens here is that the trout lily blooms and then regresses. Its leaves sort of shrivel. And when they shrivel, the fungal web takes sugar from the trout lily and gives it to the maple trees, which are just starting to leaf out. the maples hold on to that sugar during the summer, but then when they drop their leaves, and when trees drop their leaves, they suck back a lot of the nutrients. So when they drop their leaves, they send sugar to the trout lilies, which are then building up their bulbs for the next spring's blooming. So this to me is pretty amazing. And the other thing is, I've been talking as if it's nothing but sugar, but in fact, the trees are exchanging all kinds of things through this fungal network. And it's not just NPK and water, but although they are doing that, but it's also, for example, defense signal molecules. So in other words, if one tree is attacked by an insect pest, that signal goes out through the web and it tells the other plants or the other trees, because this works over a wide variety of types of plants, that they should ratchet up their defenses. So because plants are smarter than humans in many ways, they don't maintain expensive defenses all the time. I mean, defenses, it's not just the Pentagon that's expensive. It's very expensive for a plant metabolically to produce defensive chemicals. So they don't do it unless they have to, but they get these signals via the web. There also sometimes are chemical warfare molecules, but those are rarer and only from certain plants, like something like a eucalyptus might send that out. So this is what Samard calls tree talk. And tree talk turns out not to be a simple conversation. So this has really ecosystem-wide effects, and you can read those. They are very important. So who's making the decision to share resources? Is it the trees? Is it the fungi? These quotes from a paper that was published relatively recently says that it's the fungus that is making the decisions. And it points out that from the viewpoint of the fungus, the species of plant doesn't matter. What's important for the fungus is not only for its livelihood to have some plants that it is getting benefits from in the web, but also the fungus is thinking to the future. If some plants die, if something attacks one species of tree or some other plant in its net, it needs others. So the fungus cares not about any given species, but about keeping the ecosystem healthy. It's to the fungal, it's interesting that they talk about diversifying the carbon portfolio of the fungus. The forest may in fact be socialist, but what's interesting to me is how capitalist language is starting to sneak back into how people are seeing these fungal exchanges. In fact, it may be both the fungus and the plant. They may take turns. They may have trade-offs. For example, although to some extent the fungus seems to be just taking excess sugars from the plant and ferrying them around to wherever they're needed. In fact, the plant is not completely helpless by a long shot. And one thing we've learned relatively recently is that it is giving more sugar to its seedlings. So it's having some little say in this trade. So, and now, with apologies, I'm going to complicate the situation because I've been acting as though all mycorrhizal fungi are more or less the same, and they're not. Not only do different mycorrhizal fungi offer different benefits to their plants, but there are different types of mycorrhizal fungi. The orchids are, starting from the bottom, the orchids are highly specialized. We're going to forget them, but I just felt I had to be honest and show them. The ericoid fungi are specialized to heaths and bogs, that is, very acidic, impoverished environments. So they would operate in places where, say, blueberries or heathers or plants like that are. I'm really going to talk about ectos and endos. And if you read about this, the endos are often called arbuscular or AM fungi, and the ectos are called EM. And the endo and ecto thing is just that endomycorrhizal fungi penetrate the root and actually penetrate inside the cells, whereas the ecto penetrates the root but then puts a web around the cells. So, but they are quite different. So the endos affiliate with maybe 200,000 species of plants. They are the original mycorrhizas. When the first plant came onto dry land, it probably came with an endo partner. Whereas the ectos, which have evolved much more recently, affiliate with a much smaller number of species of plants. The ectos probably evolved around the time that the trees evolved, and they are the partners of most species of our northern trees and other things as well, but mostly trees. Notice that although there are about 10,000 species of ectos, and we think that they evolved maybe more than 50 times, by the way, the endos don't have species. They have something called operational taxonomic units, which means that they are such bizarre organisms that it's almost impossible to figure out what constitutes a species in an endo. Endos have giant spores, and when you look at what's inside those spores, they have tons of chromosomes. They have, in fact, what looks like the genomes for many different individuals, if you could only work it out. So they basically don't have species and they don't have sex. The ectos have sex. The ectos are the ones that, some of them, make mushrooms because they are able to have sex. So I mean, basically, think about an organism that doesn't have sex and doesn't have recognizable species. There is nothing for natural selection to work on. And maybe this is why they have not evolved and they have stayed so primitive. But they have the majority of the world's plants. So on the left, there's a cross section of what an an arbuscular endomycorrhizal root looks like. And on the right, we have a root that's colonized by an ecto. So looking on the left, you'll see that inside some of the plant root cells are these things that look sort of like fuzzy brushes. And people have thought they looked like little tiny trees. And these are the arbuscules that give the arbuscular fungi their name. And on the right, you see the ectos are the ones that coat the plant roots in a mantle, and they're the ones that therefore can protect their plant roots from pathogens in the soil. So the endos in general are much sort of more transient relationships when they form a mycorrhiza. They go into some of the cells, they form arbuscules, there's a nutrient exchange, and then the arbuscules disappear, those cells sort of collapse, and the fungus moves on to another point on the root. They have spores that can be viable in soil for a while, but the hypha that emerges waits until it gets a signal that a root is nearby. The endos are obligate plant symbionts. They cannot survive on their own except for the lifetime of a spore. If the hypha doesn't find a root fast enough, it actually will retract back into the spore, or it will die. And the spore does not have an infinite lifetime. So the ectos, on the other hand, are much tougher and much more independent. They evolved from saprophytic fungi, and they have retained some of those characteristics of fungi that can rot organic matter. So if there is no root, or the root they're affiliated with dies, they can continue to survive on their own. And their mycorrhizae are much longer lived, whereas a particular mycorrhiza that's from an endo may have a lifetime in weeks, and ectomycorrhiza may have a lifetime in years. So these are quite different. So the ectos are protecting their tree partners from soil pathogens, both by acidifying the soil and putting this physical protective mantle on the soil. That is why our forests, the boreal forests, can have tree groupings that are same species. We can have, for example, a big patch of nothing but birch, or a big patch of nothing but hemlock or white pine. This is, an example of Douglas fir. But the tropical rainforest is endomycorrhizal, and therefore it does not have that kind of protection against soil pathogens. And this has affected the way the whole ecosystem of a tropical forest, which is that there are said to be 16,000 species, but you don't get groupings of any one of those species. So you may have one mahogany tree, say, but the next mahogany tree may be a mile away because they don't have the protection from soil pathogens that our trees have. So here are some other endomycorrhizal ecosystems. The first three are natural, and the second three are made by humans. And the natural ones are more like the tropical rainforest in that there are many, many species, and any given plot is likely to have all those species, not just, you don't have a group of one thing and then a group of another. You have these mixtures. The problem is farmland. The epitome of the same species grouping is an agricultural crop, and yet these are endomycorrhizal, so they don't have built-in protection from mycorrhizae against soil pathogens. And in fact, our farming methods have invited diseases by monoculture and then have made it even more difficult for potential fungal partners to come into this situation. Every time you plow, harrow, rototill, you are breaking up the fungal web. When I first heard about the plow that broke the plains, I was thinking in terms of the Little House series, and that it makes life so easy for Pa and his horses. But in fact, it was the beginning of the dust storms and the end of our fertile grasslands. So the fungicides are obvious why that is not good for mycorrhizal fungi. The long open fallow periods are a problem because of the transience of endomycorrhizal fungi in soil, that their lifetime may be shorter than a really long fallow period. Commercial hybrid seeds, it turns out that these seeds have been bred for all kinds of weird traits, or maybe they picked them up accidentally, but they do not often welcome mycorrhizal fungi. So that is another problem. Fertilizer. Why is fertilizer bad? Well, basically, if the plant is getting its N, P, and K from the farmer, why should it bother with a mycorrhizal partner to give it that? So we have been talking about, the mycorrhizal web, the fungal web, making a lot of decisions. And we have to ask ourselves, how many decisions are plants making? How smart are plants? And it turns out plants are very smart. So the plants are not just sitting there accepting any fungal partner who comes along. They are making decisions all the time. They are deciding which fungal partners would be worthwhile for them. They not only are accepting those fungal partners, but if they find a fungal partner they really like, or if there's a fungal partner close by that there are no roots for, the plant will make roots or make extra roots for that particular fungal partner. Similarly, if it has a fungal partner that it took on because it was, for example, supplying phosphorus, and then that fungus stops supplying phosphorus, the plant will let it go. It will, I mean, it's amazing to think that you have a tree with this extensive root system, and it has thousands and thousands of these tiny mycorrhizas all over its roots with, you know, dozens or even 100 fungal species, and it's keeping track of them. There are some fungi that are good at being kind of useless and letting the plant keep it. But by and large, the tree knows what is happening and it gets rid of any fungus that it doesn't think it needs. So one of the problems is that if you give the plant, say, nitrogen or phosphorus, it decides that it does not need those particular mycorrhizal fungi that we're giving it that. So does that matter? Well, in the long run, it does matter. So the scientists who are looking at the evolution of these systems, the plant fungal system, experimentally, are using soybeans and their rhizobia. It's not, this is a plant bacterial partnership, but it's a very, very good analogy for the plant fungal partnership. Each of these little nodules on the root is a rhizobium, and each one represents a clone of a particular bacteria, a particular nitrogen fixing bacteria. So the problem is, if you have wild soybeans, they will pick the best bacteria, the bacteria that are giving them the most nitrogen. And then the soil is enriched by, you know, over time, you collect these high quality bacteria. There's sort of you know, there's a dual or a symbiotic evolution of the best plants and the best bacteria on those fields. But farmers now plant soybeans and they give them nitrogen. So the plant really doesn't have any incentive to look for the absolutely most effective bacteria. And in fact, it turns out when people look at this, that over time, the quality of the rhizobial bacteria in those fields goes down and you lose excellence. So why should the plant waste sugar on something that it doesn't need? So I've been, unlike a neat field with rows of plants, natural ecosystems are much messier and sometimes mess is really the way to go. So I've been talking as if all our northern trees are ectos and other types of plants are endos, but some northern trees are endos. For example, maples. This is why if you're looking for mushrooms, you don't look under maples, you look under conifers and oaks and birches, but forget the maples. But that is why maples can form a web with a flowering bulb. This is an endomycorrhizal web. Fruit trees are mostly endos. And that means that they're not great at getting, they're not great at getting all the water and other things that they really need. It's the ectomycorrhizal fungi that are really good at long distance transport of nutrients and water. So some orchardists will plant what they call bridge trees. Bridge trees are sort of what I think of as actually junk trees, like things in the willow family, poplars, alders, things like that, that turn out to be able to accommodate both ecto and endo mycorrhizae. So on the one hand, they can form webs with all kinds of plants and with each other. And they're very good at transporting water, as we all know, and at the same time, they can form a bridge to the fruit trees and give them the water and the nutrients that they need. So there are all kinds of things, but having very, very neat plots is not really the way to take advantage of whatever nature is offering. So just,
Hey, Susan.
yeah, should I
Hi,
stop?
this is Mike. Yeah, well, I'm completely fascinated, but we're running up a little bit to a time limit here. And so I
Okay,
didn't know if there was a couple of
that's
last
it.
things
I
you just
will
wanted to squeeze in.
wait. It's fine.
Super. Thank you so much.
Wait, I just want to, let me give you just, here's a book that I recommend if you're interested in using fungi in agriculture. And here's a great book about the forest. And then